Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Niro Brando, and I'm the publisher of the book. I'd like to welcome you all here today, but I'll speak a bit more later. First of all, I'd like to point out that the restrooms are down the side here, and they're clearly marked by a blue sign. And I'd like to call upon Janet Jobson, whose wonderful abode we are in today. Thank you so much. She's the director of the Tutu Foundation and the museum. So she very graciously, when we called for a venue to launch the book, she very graciously opened her doors and let us use her facility. Thank you so much, and I'd like to call upon you to come and do the formal welcome.
Good evening, everyone. It's such a treat to have all of you here, and I always feel particularly moved when we have members of the Tutu family with us here at the foundation. So very particularly warm welcome to Tunisia. Thank you for making it. Here at the Tutu Legacy Foundation, our work is really about facilitating uncompromised voices of bravery in the world. It's about the work of societal healing. And we do this through both trying to commemorate and preserve the example of the Arch and Mambea. We have a wonderful exhibition, which if you haven't yet come to visit, please do. It's open, I'll do the little advertising pitch, Tuesdays to Saturdays, 9:30 to 3:30. And it's an extraordinary opportunity to really reflect on the impact of such an extraordinary life lived by the Arch and such an extraordinary impact of the activism of the churches against apartheid. And we also work on a range of different programs to try and continue the legacy of bravery, of speech to power, of really trying to embody in the world this extraordinary voice of moral courage that the Arch had. So it's wonderful for me personally to be able to learn this evening from the extraordinary experiences of Dan, to learn from the family. We always are trying to get deeper and deeper into understanding what we can draw from the example of the Arch and how we can live out his values and his example every single day. So thank you all for joining us this evening. I'm sure it's going to be a wonderful time. Thanks.
Thank you, Janet. Before we get started and go into the keynote address, I'd like to just tell you all how this whole relationship with Dan Vaughan and African Sun Media started. It was actually on this book here, which we launched in October last year, that both Nontombi and Dan Vaughan contributed a chapter to. And then Sarojini Nadar, the chair, the Tutu chair at the University of Western Cape, who edited this book, brought along Dan's proposal to us, and we immediately jumped at the idea. It's not very often as a publisher when you get a book that resonates with you and your own ethos. And this one did, so much so that I personally got involved in language editing and so forth, and got involved in the design of the cover and worked very closely with Dan throughout the process, him in Sedgefield and myself in Stellenbosch. And it was really a wonderful, enriching experience working with him and engaging with the text, more so because it's such an honest account and it speaks so much about the personal transformation of a person who was largely complacent and indifferent to becoming aware and an activist through his role in the South African Council of Churches. And reading Dan's honest account of that transformation for me was really very, very interesting. And he tells it in such a simple, humble way that it makes it so engaging as well as content. And saying those few words, I'd like to introduce the Reverend Nontombi Naomi Tutu, who is a missioner for the racial and economic equity at the Cathedral of All Souls, Asheville, NC. The challenges of growing up Black and female in apartheid South Africa have been the foundation of Reverend Tutu's life as an activist for human rights. She is the fourth child and third daughter of Desmond Impilo and Leah Nomaliso Tutu. Her professional experience ranges from being development consultant in West Africa to being program coordinator for programs on race and gender-based violence in education at the African Gender Institute at the University of Western Cape. She wrote the foreword, a very glowing foreword for the book, recounting her own personal experience of the relationship that her late dad and Dan shared. But with not saying too much more, I've been under strict instructions from Mr. Vaughan to keep it tight. And in my effort to do so, I would like to hand over to Reverend Nontombi Tutu.
Thank you. Thank you. I have a hard time speaking sitting down, so I'm going to stand up. And I am honored to be here this evening, and exceedingly honored when Dan reached out to me and asked me if I would be willing to write the foreword to the book. I was like, why? Don't you know anybody else? So thank you, Dan, for doing me that honor. As I read the book, I came to know some of the stories that I had been kind of on the sidelines of and knew part of the story, didn't know the whole story, and getting to read the book and hear the stories, it made me recognize the truth of what Daddy used to say, which is that if you see somebody standing ahead above the crowd, then you should know that it is because he is being carried on the shoulders of those the others in the crowd. And that was so clearly Daddy's experience in working, whether it was working at the SACC, whether it was working at Bishop's Court in the church, at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that Daddy himself would always say how fortunate he had been in those who surrounded him in the work that he did. He used to say that, the reason that I was selected to be the one known was because I had a big nose and an easy name. And then when he used to talk to the young people at Peace Jams, he would say, and also because I have sexy legs, which he didn't, but it's okay. We let him believe it. But that the caliber of people who Daddy had around him in his work was what allowed him to be the Arch. And he was so clear that if it had not been for the support of people like Dan, that, he would not have had the Nobel Peace Prize. And that, in fact, I think that, in fact, the Nobel Committee changed the rules after Daddy won the prize, because when Daddy won the prize, the thing was that the recipient was allowed to invite whoever they liked to the ceremony. And then when Daddy's guests rocked up, like 200 of us from all over the world, I think the Norwegians are like, okay, next time we will tell people you can only have 50 people here with you for this. When Daddy was at the SACC, and I speak about this in the foreword a little bit, that at the time when the clergy marched in Johannesburg, when they were all arrested, I say that it speaks volumes about how little those around him listened to Daddy, was that they had said only the clergy are going to march, because if we are arrested, at least as clergy, we have some level of protection. And only the clergy marched except for Dan and my mom. And so the two people who were not meant to be on the march were the people who were attached to Daddy, not to any other clergy person in that march. And Daddy, when he spoke about it, said, you know, I was angry when I saw them at the end because he was at the front and they were further back, and he didn't see them until they were actually at the jail. And he said to my mom, who's looking after the children? Mind you, by that time, I think their youngest child was 18 and away at college. But that he said, you know, when I first saw them, my initial reaction was, why didn't you listen? But then there was that sense of pride that people that were part of his community wanted to be sure that they knew what was going on with him. And so Dan Vaughan, which is one of the things I found out in the book, that is how Dan got his nickname that we have known him by, Vaughan, for so many years. It was when they were arrested and the prison officer, seeing the name Vaughan, pronounced it Vaughan. And so everybody who had been arrested with them started calling Dan Vaughan. And we just thought that was his nickname. And so we have called Dan Vaughan for the longest. And I think that's the only thing my children know him as. It has been, for us as a family too, was that knowing that when Daddy was traveling, he was traveling with somebody who cared about him the way that Dan cared. Somebody who made sure that Daddy would have the time to pray. That was so important to him. That Daddy would have the things that he loved. Milkshakes, rum and coke for a little while, strawberry daiquiris for a little while, but that knowing that he had someone with him who truly loved him and truly believed in the work that he was doing was, for us as a family, something that allowed us to be free with Daddy's many travels in the many places that he went. And as I said at the beginning, it has been amazing, the shoulders that have carried Daddy all these many years. We have been blessed by the people who worked with him, who worshiped with him, who cared about him, who stood by him when many in this country hated him and considered him one of the most evil people. That he had people like Dan, like John, like so many who constantly reminded him, even in those days when he got upset. Because Daddy's greatest weakness, I think, was loving being loved. And so being hated was a huge burden for him. And to have people like Dan to remind him on those days when the hate felt particularly heavy, that he was not alone, and that the lies were indeed lies, has meant everything. And so I am so glad to be a part of this book launch and to have had a little part in the book. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nantombi, for that wonderful address and giving us your personal account of the relationship between your late dad and Vaughan. I also picked that up in the book and the march. I'd like to now, Dan, in his humility, and also to lend some youthful character to an otherwise aged program, has kindly invited his granddaughter Leila Emden to do a reading from the book. And collectively they've chosen which part of the book she would like to read. So Leila, if you'd come up to the stage, please, and do the reading.
I just want to say before I read that on behalf of the family, it's so wonderful to be here and for this to be happening and for this to be published and for my grandfather's story to be out in the world for us to share. So thank you. Thank you very much. I'm going to read the epilogue. Tutu died peacefully at the age of 90 on the 26th of December 2021. His funeral in Cape Town St. George's Cathedral was held soon after. I flew down from my home in Sedgefield to attend. It was a wet, drizzly day, unusual in our mostly warm and dry summers. My grandson James drove me to the city centre and helped me through the tight security arrangements up to the door of the cathedral. I already knew, with the COVID pandemic regulations still in place, that only 100 mourners would be permitted to attend. The regulations also required that we should sit apart from each other. So in the relative silence of a small congregation and social distancing, with time on our hands, here was ample inducement for quiet reflection before the service commenced. Time enough for me to remember the days that I had spent with him. My thoughts ranged wide, places we had visited and the details of the events that had taken place there. The crush of crowds clamoring to hear him, the people I met, and the requests from passers-by for the photos at airports. I remembered also our earlier days together at the SACC, the many meetings, the long busy hours, and also the times when all seemed so dark. There were also the more personal memories, conversations, the Eucharists we had shared. There were many happy recollections of his friendship and generosity to me. I thought too of his darker hours, where I witnessed his solitary anguish as so much was demanded of him. Though I was missing him terribly there, it was a peaceful moment. Then, as we watched, came the procession of the clergy, signaling the commencement of the service. There, flanked by the pallbearers, his grandchildren, was Tutu's simple coffin. And in that instant, the contentment of happy memories fled. Leaping into the void came an overwhelming sense of loss. It was for myself initially, but then often softening for the nation and the entire world. Who would take his place? What leader was there now on this planet who could fill this huge gap of goodness he had left? Who will be there to say fearlessly to the nation and the world, this is wrong? I still wonder, who is there to tell us, as persuasively as Tutu did, that we should all treat the other with respect, as fellow creatures of God? And, as he reminded us, even those whom we dislike. He told us that there were no exceptions in God's love for his children. Perhaps it is Tutu himself who provides us with the answer to that question. When he called on the world to help South Africa to rid itself of apartheid, it was to the everyday people of the world that he addressed himself. He called on the ordinary citizens whose votes for or against could uphold or topple the authorities that had shut their eyes to that evil. And when the Nobel Peace Prize came, the leaders listened, for the world had spoken. Significantly, during frequent travels in his later years, it was to the aspirations to goodness within the ordinary people of the world that he addressed himself. We salute those whose mission it is to teach and share the legacy of Desmond Tutu, not merely in telling of his exploits, but in ensuring that his message of peace, through respect and love is heard throughout the world. Such as those of the Tutu Legacy Foundation in Cape Town and the students at the peace centers at our universities here and across the world who, studying Tutu's legacy, seek to put its lessons into place. And we salute also the ordinary women and men of our world who in their everyday lives seek to emulate the secret of Desmond Tutu's greatness. The man of God who, holding the deep mystery of his personal faith silently within, strode the world stage with a clear message of hope and love. Thank you.
Thank you, Leila. Thank you, Leila. The manuscript was completed long before the passing of the Arch, and this was added as the final chapter in the book. But I'd like to, it's remiss of me, Dan, not to have introduced you earlier, but I think so many people in the room know you. So I would like to go into a bit of a conversation with Dan and Ntombi and with you all. And before I do that, I'd just like to give you a bit of a resume. Dan is a South African born in Cape Town. In 1976, he was invited to join the staff of the South African Council of Churches, where he worked under the Arch for 7 years, eventually as his Assistant General Secretary. He resigned after Tutu left the SACC to work in the Order of St. John, or the St. John's Ambulance Service, as Regional and National Director. In 2003, Archbishop Tutu asked him to join him in his office in Milnerton, near Cape Town. He served there as his travel aide and manager of his office until 2011, when Tutu retired from active involvement in international affairs. So I would like to take questions now, and I don't know what's coming up on the chat. If I could ask James to give me a bit of assistance there, I would appreciate it. But in getting the ball rolling, can I kick off with you, Ntombi? Dan writes in the book, you spoke about the arrest, but then Dan writes a very graphic account of the burning of the SACC offices, the mysterious burning. And there were obviously these kinds of not too subtle threats made by the apartheid regime against the life of your late dad and people like Vaughan. Tell me, as a family, what did you feel and how did you cope with this fear of knowing that one day your dad may not come home?
So, so mommy and daddy were very upfront with us from early that, you know, that was a possibility. That there was a possibility of arrest, there was a possibility of being killed, and that the thing that they wanted us to know was that they were doing what they believed needed to be done, and that you know, that we should not then live our lives constantly in the fear of what might happen to them. And clearly, you know, it's one thing to be told that, it's another thing to actually try and live that. So, when they were arrested, I was actually on my way back from college in the States and had changed flights in Amsterdam. And the person next to me was holding a newspaper that said priests arrested and clergy arrested. And I, at first, didn't pay attention. And then I looked and I was like, oh my gosh, that's my dad! And grabbed the person's newspaper. So being prepared and told that not to let this be a thing of concern is easier said than done. But I think that because we spoke about it a lot, and they were very clear that this was a choice that they have made for their lives and for our country, that then we could pack the fear and concern away and live. Right.
Okay, thank you for that. Thank you for that. James, Julian, are there any questions from the chat?
No.
Okay, all right. Anybody from the floor have questions? Yeah, I'll go down. Okay, if there's no other questions, I want to ask one more. I know your late father and the Dalai Lama were very close. How did he take the news that South Africa was denying him a visa, especially to come for a Nobel elders gathering, and that the ANC government, whom he kind of worked very closely with all his life, had now become so parochial as to take the China line and deny a freedom fighter the right to visit and to be reunited with him?
So I think almost everybody knows how he reacted, right? We have that tape that is played back over and over at different times. Watch out! I'm telling you, watch out! So yes, he was very upset by it. That particularly, I think that knowing how much people in the rest of the world had supported us in our struggle, and how much we had called on the world to put pressure on countries like the US and Great Britain in the struggle against apartheid, and how regular people in those countries, regular people in those countries had taken up our struggle. And here we are, one of the world's most beloved resistance leaders, one of the most peaceful people on the planet, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and who, he and Daddy had built a really close relationship. And so that he was turned down not once, that he was turned down a number of times, it was heartbreaking and infuriating for Daddy. Yes, definitely.
Okay, thank you for that. Dan, if I could bring you into the conversation, the earlier years that you speak of, when South Africa had this very conservative kind of clergy that was dominated by the Afrikaner reformists, you speak about they would call you a verraaier, traitor, and so forth. Can you give us more insight on the landscape in which you came into the picture, and what the state of the church in South Africa was?
With pleasure. And let me say hello to you while I'm on the screen, I presume. It's my background. It's the conservative church, in particular the evangelical church, whose concern and proper concern for truth made them believe that the government was right, that any government was right. It was something ingrained in us, something with which we were born. It was part of growing up. And so when the so-called liberal church, and the Anglican church in particular, was seen in this light, started to speak of political freedom or rights for all, it was seen as an attack on faith, which it certainly was not. That was the climate. And certain churches, in fact, at that stage, left their membership. They had been members of the Council of Churches for many years, since its inception. But in the 60s and early 70s, they resigned because their people felt they were betraying the cause of Christ, which was not the case. So the church was divided, as it was across the world, I know, in those days, between conservative and evangelical, conservative evangelicals and so-called liberals. And there were arguments on statements of faith. Those days are past us now, but they were dark days because it really meant that one was constricted in one's perspective. And when I joined the Council of Churches, it was seen as a betrayal of my faith, betrayal of the church, betrayal of the mission of the church, betrayal even of Christ. That is the background to those days, which were the colonial days of our country.
Thank you for that, Dan. I've got a similar question that has come up. I didn't see it earlier. What sort of response did you get through those years from your own church circles? So in your own church circles, what kind of response did you get from them?
In my own congregation, I was part of the congregation, and there it was fine because they knew me and they trusted me, and they didn't always understand me, and there was happy acceptance. And there are people sitting in the audience today who were there for me then. Not everybody, because one day in church there was a lady, I think she may not have been deranged, who got up and started screaming at me about betraying my country and going to the devil and providing guns for terrorists. It was a very dark experience. I just got up and walked out. But so there were those in my own church, sure. But there were those who were on the other side as well, who understood. The bottom line was that when I went into the Council of Churches, my own denominational shibboleths were removed one by one, but my faith became stronger. I was more aware of God's goodness and his hand in my life. So the things that I lost were not important. It was behavioral things, patterns of thinking. And I found myself among a wide range of people who loved God with the fullness of their hearts. Their ways of worship were different from mine. And I believed in the way I worshipped, but they were God's people. And I understood then the width of God's church. But there were those who were attacked, and it wasn't pleasant, but that's past now, long ago.
Thank you for that, Dan. We seem to have another question, specifically relating to your and the Arch's visit to Colombia. Would you relate one or two anecdotes from that visit and on the peacekeeping process?
Yes, Colombia was, and it still is, as far as I'm aware, a drug-ridden country, and the FARC rebels in the mountains, large swathes of Colombia in South America, were in the hands of the rebels, and they were planting drugs and selling them, and the government was powerless. But there was a breakthrough just at that time, and the president and the government of the country called Archbishop Tutu in to facilitate a private conference, but with the government's blessings, as I understood it, where numbers of people could get together and receive input on the concept of peace. And there was a contingent from South Africa led by the Arch, but there were others as well who came in and addressed the conference. And so we were there. It was a strange environment. We were guarded day and night by soldiers. We went out to have a meal with some of the conference organizers, and the house was heavily guarded. We were safe, of course, but it was an environment of hurt and fear. I remember one of the little side ceremonies was a meeting. I didn't understand all that was happening. It was in Spanish. Barbara Gaza, who was listening in, was there translating for us. And I saw a little boy bring up a folded flag and gave it to the Archbishop as a token of appreciation. And when I inquired from the man next door to me, it turned out it was the flag in which this little boy's father's body had been wrapped when he was killed in fighting the terrorists. At the end of the conference, we had consultations about conferring with the FARC people themselves, and I don't know whether they succeeded or not, but it was a very tense time, and you saw the Arch at work in motivating and persuading and discussing because he was a man of international reputation, they listened to him. And I believe that helped the process on. That's the Columbia story.
Okay, thank you for that, Dan. I had a related question. The Arch was also quite famous for bringing together the world's elders. How has that work gone now? Because you speak about peacekeeping in Colombia, and part of the elders' work is around, and maybe you want to come in on Tommy about what they are up to in today's war-ridden world, and what kind of efforts they are making.
Well, I mean, the elders are still in existence, and the makeup is different, obviously, and the aim continues to be the same, that they would be elders of the world and not constrained by politics or having to worry about their own reputation because of their stature as elders, and would then be able to go into different places and speak to everybody in conflicts. They've had, I think, mixed success, that they've been able to hold conversations in places where nobody has been willing to talk to the other, that have said, this person is beyond the pale, and they've been able to go and talk to both sides of those conversations. But I think that part of what is a real challenge to them is the sense that that we always want to be seen to be strong, that whichever conflict we are in, we don't want to be seen as weak. And any time that there is somebody who says, the only way you're going to solve this problem is to talk to these people that you are in conflict with, then it is as though you are asking them to be weak. And as long as everybody is intent on being strong, then conversations, being seen to be strong, not necessarily to be strong, but to be seen by the rest of the world to be strong, then it is hard work even for the elders to get conversations going.
Dan, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
No, it's just that it was a very impressive thing that Richard Branson and Peter Gabriel actually started it with Madiba. Madiba was the man they went to with the concept, and he embraced it, and then the Arch was asked to be chairman of the elders. And yes, their meetings were meetings of people who were tearfully concerned for the world, ex-foreign ministers, ex-prime ministers, people of high rank who had, as Tombi says, no more allegiance to the national entities, but people who just wanted to see the world come to be a better place. And we salute them. They work underground in one sense because they work, as we heard, to influence. But the elders are worth following, and there's a website and a page, Facebook page worth going to for them.
Okay, thank you for that, Dan. Are there any questions from the floor before I take one more from the chat? Okay, Leila, thank you. What would you like to find out from Opa?
I've got two questions. I'm going to be greedy. My first question was, you're speaking about the role of the, I think it's the Dutch Reformed Church, and how they were pro-apartheid. And my question comes from a place of being a teacher and teaching Woza Albert, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, to grade 9s this year. And the issue of the Dutch Reformed Church propping up apartheid came up. And most of my students are very religious, either Christian or Muslim, and they really struggled with this idea that there was a church that was supporting apartheid. And I explained that it's propped up by the government, that kind of thing. What they wanted to know, and I struggled to answer, and so did the kids, but where in the Bible, or what religious explanation did they give their people for this? They could not get their head around it, to the point where we had to remove a question on it from the exam because it was too hard for them to comprehend a church like that. So I'm curious to know how you would explain that to a grade 9 who can't even imagine that in their reality. So I don't know if that's my first question.
I think we'll take one at a time.
Okay, one at a time.
So I mean, want to do it, Dan? Or can I
okay, great.
and then you give the finishing polish, the in-depth explanation. So for somebody who grew up during apartheid, that we were told that, first of all, the Dutch Reformed Church and many right-wing churches believed that the story of Noah cursing his son Ham, that the son Ham was the blacks of the world, and that this was God's curse on blacks, that we would be forever hewers of wood and carriers of water. And also from the experience that I had, this idea that that Paul says that governments are given by God, and that therefore that it is the responsibility to honor whichever government you are living under. And I always remind people that, you know, you have to remember that Paul was a Roman citizen, and so for him, honoring Rome was different than the rest of most Jews honoring Rome, because for him as a citizen, he had rights in that government. And so that same idea that, you know, if you can say that this is God's blessing on governments, on leaders, therefore whatever leader you have, you are meant to honor and follow the rules that they give. Obedience, right.
Can I come in on that one too? It's actually the reason why I wrote the book in the first place. There's a softer answer from the other side, which is not an excuse by any manner of means. But in a strange, perverse way, people of faith, as much as any people, sometimes look in the Bible for the answers they want. And they adopt what the Bible speaks about the world as their formula of correctness. And so somehow they say there were slaves in the Bible, therefore slavery is okay because it suited us to have slaves, or to forbid women the votes because the Bible didn't say women could vote. So we start at our own choices and then we go to the Bible to try and justify it. And so it was with apartheid. We start where we are and we say the Bible justifies it, as Tommy said, through the stories they read and select very carefully. But the sadness is that we teach these things to our children. Racism we teach to our children. And the reason why I persevered with the book, because I thought, what hope do we have when we are born with ideas, because they're given to us with our mother's milk? How do we get out of it? How do we break loose of the chains of believing in slavery or believing in some of the perverse things like apartheid? But it's there in the Bible. Love your neighbor, and all the rest is there very plainly. And so I think it behooves each of us to be brave enough to face the truth in our churches and to allow common dissent, if you like, an argument, and to face what the Bible actually says. And then we find that the Bible is a Bible of peace and love and heartfelt care for the others. So yes, we go to the Bible to prove ourselves right, sadly.
That's amazing. I wish I could record that for class next year. Thank you. That was amazing. I also wanted to ask, in Archer's travels to other areas in the world with conflicts, how did he or you all as a team navigate the situation where there were struggles of national identity? So like a lot of South Africa was a racial identity, the TRC, places like Israel, or where else was there lots of struggles, like Ireland? How did they overcome people going, well, this is my national identity, and if we become peaceful with the enemy, we're going to dilute our national identity, which is today quite a huge issue in the world. I don't know if I'm articulating that very well, but
I've got a quick answer, I hope. There was an incident in Gaza where 19 civilians were killed, and the Human Rights Commission of the United Nations appointed a commission of inquiry with the Arch and one other lady as the commissioners. So it was his job to investigate this as a human rights violation. But, and this is the point I want to make, the Arch was meticulous in his fairness, and he would not proceed with the investigation unless the Israeli government allowed him to visit them and hear their side as well. So he heard the Palestinian side, but he wasn't allowed to hear the Israeli side. And I'm not making comment on that at all, except to say that he then determined that he was not able to conclude his investigation because the Israeli ambassador concerned was not prepared to allow him in. So the Arch was fair-minded in everything he did, in issues like that in particular. He was always there for the other side as well. And that's how he navigated what is, as you say, a very tricky position. Lavinia, who is in the audience today, his secretary, will tell you stories after stories in that connection.
Thank you very much for that, Dan. I'm going to close the Q&A session with just two questions. The first one being from Don. What is your most memorable moment with the Arch, Dan? Have we put you on the spot?
Well, yes, I'll share it. It's a brief moment. It's a brief moment, but it certainly was the most insightful. We were in his office in the SACC, and there was a call from one of the ministers of government, a man who was a very moderate man, even though he was part of the national government. And he phoned the Arch to ask him to intervene in a situation which affected students in one of the provinces in the country. And I saw the Arch break down. And his cry, as he articulated, he says, "Why me?" He was so humbled at the thought that they had asked him to move in, that his enemy, in fact, had asked him to move in that way. And I saw the Arch as a man who, as we all know, can be pretty strident and forthcoming, but a man also who felt very deeply the responsibilities that he carried as peacemaker. That was perhaps my most memorable moment with the Arch that I can come to think of.
Okay, in closing, the last question, I think it's to end on this question. Hello, dear Dan. Thank you for writing this beautiful book. How are you feeling now that it is out there for the world to see?
I wrote the book for two reasons. I've said the one was to try and unravel this enigma of colonialism, of conservatism. How do we break out of it? But the other reason was that the Arch has left a legacy of the answer to how can peace come into the world. The Bible speaks of loving your enemy. The Arch was wise enough to suggest that if you can't quite love him, you can at least respect him as a child of God. You can at least give him the dignity of who he is or who she is. And so you would make efforts to understand the other side. And that's how he lived his life. And he would make jokes with the audience about bin Laden or the gays or George Bush at the time. And the audience would burst into laughter, but they would take his point because he called on us to love the other. Not love with the heart, which is impossible, but love with the mind, love with the head, which is a love that extends goodness to the other, even if the other is hard on you. So that's the second reason why I wrote the book. And if the book can be read and something of the Arch's legacy, which is that, can filter through the students of the world, the readers of the world, the people of the world, to the world, then the Arch won't have lived in vain. He would have lived leaving a legacy of love. So if the book can be read by many people, I'll be delighted, and I'll fold up my tents and go to sleep very happily.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. That was very entertaining and very thought-provoking. Thank you, Dan, for sharing those wonderful thoughts with us. In closing, I'd just like to thank a few people for making it here tonight and contributing to the event's success. Members of the Tutu family who have come and graced us with your presence, thank you very much. Members of Dan's family, and some of them have directly helped, James Bosenberg and Julian Emden, who were with us along this journey to manage this launch. Thank you, gentlemen. And Tommy, Pumi, Vuyiswa, and Janet from the Foundation, thank you so much again for letting us use your venue and being so gracious in letting us do what we want with it. Thank you. And finally, ladies and gentlemen, in thanking the caterer, I'd like to point out that cold drinks and teas and so forth are at the back of the room, together with some light refreshments. And for that, I'd like to thank Eunice from Authentic Cuisine. Finally, you know, when I get an exciting book, I usually take a bright young publisher with me, and she kind of works very hard next to me all the way to the launch. And for that, I'd like to thank my colleague in the back who you met when you entered, Lisa Janse van Rensburg, a young publisher who saw the passion in this project and made it a labor of love. Thank you, Lisa. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Enjoy the snacks.